Today I am finally starting on my Regency short stays. I'm using the red threaded pattern. This is going to be my first time working with a printed pattern. But this is a super easy one to be starting with. Like there's just not that many pages. So I'll be cutting that out. For this pattern, I decided to just use white coutil fabric and no fashion layer. So there will be 2 layers of this heavy duty corset coutil. Also needed are the boning. I just bought what was in the pattern, what the pattern called for. You need mostly spring steel boning and then a couple of spiral steel bonings for the side fronts. Also, you need some cotton cording to lace up the straps on the arms and the back, and I used twill tape to bind the stays. I used the print-at-home version of Red Threaded's Regency short stay patterns, which were super easy to just cut out and tape together. And I started, of course, with a mock-up, just making these stays as they were designed. I knew this pattern was going to need adjustments as the largest size it comes in is only an XXL, and I have a lot of real estate to deal with, shall we say. So the only thing I did change in my first mock-up was widening the bust gores, which is recommended in the pattern directions if you do have a larger bust. A nice part about working with mock-ups is you can use really cheap fabric to help you understand techniques, like inserting these bust gores. That was my first time doing anything like that. Unfortunately, this first mock-up was so bad, I couldn't even really put it on, so I didn't even take any video because it looked terrible. The overall construction went okay. It was more of a problem that they were super short and the bust gores were also too short that there wasn't even enough room for me to put it on to try to figure out what I needed to change. So I sort of just used intuition to figure out what I would need to do to make it fit better. To make the second mock-up wearable, I needed to add an inch of width to the front center of the stays, which widened where the cups were so that it would actually fit me. I also lengthened the pattern by 2 inches, and for the bust gores, I lengthened them and slightly widened them. I did see talk in blogs that lengthening the bust gores could end up messing up your achieved silhouette, which should be sort of like a shelf for the boobs to sit in, but turns out my shelf needed all the help it could get. And with all these changes, I could actually put the stays on, and because I'm lazy and sort of impatient, I just moved right along from these to the actual stays. I have a bad habit of pretty much ignoring pattern instructions in favor of what makes sense to me, which is exactly what happened here. I didn't want to deal with seam finishing or adding on fabric to make separate boning channels, so instead I decided to make the stays 2 layers and sandwich the wrong sides together. These things are sturdy, let me tell you, with 2 layers of this corset coutil. They are strong.
I'm done working.
No, you're not.
I am.
Then why are we going to my parents'?
It's like, no, it's too early.
I stitched everything up with the 5/8 seam allowance that the pattern called for, and I marked up where all the boning channels will need to be sewn in. If I was being extra careful and precise, I definitely would have basted these 2 layers together before stitching in the boning channels to make sure that nothing moves while you're sewing, but I definitely just threw some pins in. This doesn't have boning channels like 18th century stays do everywhere. It just has very strategic ones on the seams. That in combination with the fact that this coutil is like bulletproof, it's like super, it doesn't have any stretch to it whatsoever, so I just didn't even worry about it. Now moving on to the next step, which is the bust gores, which are definitely the trickiest part of the stays construction. And the first step to do those is to stitch around the cutting lines that I've drawn on. So the 2 lines on either side get stitched down, around, and up, very close to the line that was drawn. These slashes are then cut open, careful not to clip what was just sewed along those lines. The raw edges need to be turned back about 1/8 of an inch, so there is no raw edge on the front. This was really tricky to iron with the 2 stiff layers of coutil without burning the crap out of my fingers. And it was also a problem in the little narrow section between the two. Every time I tried to iron down one side, it would like iron flat the other one. And I had a really hard time getting both of them to lie flat inwards instead of one pressing out and one pressing in. For the actual gore part, I decided to only use one layer. There's no reason here to use two layers. It's not like there are any boning in the actual gores. So you just cut those out, and I marked on the seam allowance onto the front piece so I could see exactly where I wanted to pin them in place. And that was 5/8 away from the edge around the whole thing on either side of the V. Sewing these in place is probably the scariest part because you're top stitching them, so the stitches need to be really neat and parallel to the edge of that gore. I found the tip really tricky because the turned over edge gets really narrow along the cutting line at the bottom on that point, so it kept wanting to flip back out, and I would try to like shove it back under to keep the raw edges from flipping out, but you can always use hand reinforcement stitches to cover up those places at the point where the raw edges end up showing. The last step before being able to fit these on is adding eyelets. The coutil was so sturdy, I had to actually puncture them with the tip of the embroidery scissors before being able to shove the awl through, which was the first time I've experienced that, and I've made eyelets in like many layers of fabric, so that's a helpful tip I can give if you're having a hard time getting the awl to go through. I just made like the tiniest puncture, trying not to cut really any of the threads, just help get them started getting pushed out of the way. Also, I will admit here that I have still not embroidered the eyelets, even though I've had these for like 3 months and worn them 10 times. This fabric is so heavy, as I've said a million times, they don't need it. Now that I can finally try them on, it revealed that I made the bust gores just a bit too wide, so I actually ended up making the center two a tiny bit narrower, so the bust gores don't match on either side, but you can't really tell in the end. And to do this, I just pinned them in a bit. I don't know if you can see the pins in them now. That was a little bit too much, so I let it out a bit and then just re-sewed them in. To finish off the inside, I just flipped those bust gore edges inwards and sewed those down to finish them off. So I've gotten my supplies to finish these. My plan, so there's 2 1/4 inch bones in here right now. I have like 2 stacked on top to make them long enough. So I ordered 7-inch ones that should go from end to end, but unfortunately I bought 1/2 inch ones. So now the question is, do I just do 2 and just make it 2 of the 1/4 inch ones? They're, they're still flexible, but they're definitely tougher than the 1/4 inch ones. Or I could do maybe 3 per se. But then the other option is this is a painting stick that I have cut down. And do I just go straight for the busk? Do I just avoid all comfort and go straight for this? This is like the backup plan if these still just like don't do what I need them to do. I think my plan is to just start with the 2. And actually what I might, because I have enough bones, maybe I'll just stack 2 bones in the boning channel. Is that like against the rules? I think I'm gonna do that. So I'll need to rip out the seams, the boning channels, I mean. But then also we have a problem because these bones I also got to put here, and that's not gonna fit there. So I gotta rip these out as well. So that's kind of a bummer. But, so that's the next steps. Put in the different boning. All right, the new bones are in place. I doubled them up, and I think that's going to work fine. I'm just gonna move on, I think. The back, I took a little bit out of the back. So basically, yeah, so if I open this up, you can see where the holes used to be. So I took out like 1/4 of an inch on each side so that I can poke new holes and that they don't show in the final product. They're just like tucked inside here, which I think is perfect because I needed to take some out of the back anyway so that I could get a tighter fit. But that's what these look like now. And surprisingly, the next step is actually just binding them off. They're basically done. Like when I was trying them on before, everything, well, the very last step will be adding some decorative reinforcement on the edges of the bust gores. But that will be like last. And then eyelets, of course, will come. But once I put the binding on, the like construction part is done. And I'm going to just be machine stitching on the front. So I'll be lining up the tape along the edges and stitching the 1/4 of an inch and then just turning it around to the back side and then hand stitching it down with no fold because this tape is finished off on the edges. For the top binding, I will be adding a drawstring in the middle here. So I have ended the binding and I have attached in the drawstring on that seam, just like in the binding. I don't know if that'll be strong enough, just so that I could have that in there when I flip this over. And also, this is a little tricky. I don't know if you're supposed to use this stuff as binding. So you have to like gather it up a little bit around the curves so that when I turn it over, they're kind of ugly. But the edge of this that I was worried about looks okay. It's not as ugly as I thought that was going to be. So now I'm just gonna repeat on this side, pinning on and then stitching down the binding. So I thought I'd put my face in a video because I always seem to crop out my head on accident, but thank you so much for watching. These turned out, I think, as good as they could. I know larger busts really should do long stays for Regency periods so you can have that long bust down the center to hold everything in place, but short stays are just so cute that I wanted to try to get this to work. And I think my slight changes to the pattern helped. The way I changed the gores and I added the drawstring, and the center is 4 1/2 inch bones, metal ones that are on top. So there's 2 on top on either side, and I think it's doing a good job at doing what a busk would do, but just like a little bit less heavy duty. And the fit, I think, is good. I think it's giving me the right silhouette, and it'll be great for building the layers on top. So stay tuned for the next steps of my Regency wardrobe. Now that the underwear is pretty much done, all I need is like a bodiced petticoat, which is just like a very simple long petticoat with straps, because there is no waistline to like tie a skirt onto in the Regency period, because you want your skirt to come up to here for modesty purposes if your dress is sheer. So it has like these little straps. So I'll be making that, and then a dress to go over it will be the next step. So hopefully this helped if you're looking to make Regency stays, and thanks for watching.